one of the things that I've talked about in my most recent newsletter is a 5-step process. Just very briefly, very quick and easy portfolio review, because one of the things that happens after you've come off this just huge long period of expansion that we've had is your portfolio kind of gets like your closet, right? It gets full of junk. And without a lot of intense financial pressure, nobody's really bothered to take the time to sort of clean things up. So quick and dirty portfolio review. Revisit your strategy, because the strategy from 6 months ago may or may not be fit for purpose today. Then come up with some screening statements, and I encourage you to do that before you start making any decisions, because otherwise the whole process gets completely balled up in politics and preferences and blah, blah, blah. So if you can all agree on the screening criteria, then go through and rank order everything that's in your portfolio, above a certain threshold, and then start making some decisions about disengagement. Now, what that hopefully will do for you is give you some resources to play with. And that's what you need to then go look at the explore part. So kind of how do you now get into some new areas where your capabilities might be relevant? And then the last piece is really use a discovery approach, which the three of us have talked about a lot, to plan what those next steps look like. So if you're interested in this, you can find out more, either drop me a line or it's on my website. And it's all kind of laid out in an orderly fashion there. So quick and dirty portfolio review.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. That's consistent with the 5 strategic COVID-19 mistakes piece that we're writing. So you'll see lots of overlap in citations of Rita in that, and a big nod to discovery-driven planning as the 5th fix, right? So, and that connects to your recent article in HBR as well on digital transformation. So, so this is great. We've I think at least had half the participants in the webinar have managed to get into this, have been adding their thoughts. And so what we've done right now with this virtual poster, we've taken 2 think wrong exercises that we tend to run almost in every gathering that we have, at least, where we're looking at what's the current state. So when we looked at the predictable path in terms of how do we respond to a crisis, we were describing the current state. We were describing our as is. So that predictable path, if nothing changed, this is how it would look. And there are good things about it, and there are bad things about it, and there are things that we're still trying to puzzle through. And then on the bold path, we said, what are our aspirations? So we looked at, if we deflected from the predictable path, if we changed direction, what could we hope for? What in our wildest dreams would we aspire toward? And this is giving ourselves permission to imagine a better future, to imagine a future state, which is quite different than the way we are today. With the anchors, you took stock of what's holding us back into this reality. And with the rockets, we looked at what could we actually leverage and utilize to get to that aspirational state. So I can't wait, for one, just to dig through everything that's here that everybody has offered up, because it's really helpful for us just thinking about how are we dealing with this and what could we be doing to get through. So I really appreciate the contribution everybody has made. That link remains live. You can keep getting into these posters and extracting things yourselves. The basic idea in terms of thinking wrong, one of the core frameworks for thinking wrong is this idea of the deflection point. And I see in the chat, I see lots of folks who are rejoining us. So hi to Brittany, hi to Elena, and Michael, and Stephen is in from Hamburg, and Erica Wiggins. We have quite a few people who have been through the Think Wrong training, so this will be familiar to you. And for those of you who aren't, we're just going to reiterate this one basic framework, and that is, when we're on that predictable path, there are 2 forces that are actually conspiring to keep us stuck on that path. There are 2 forces that keep us down, repeating the same sort of solutions, repeating the same approaches, and the first one is biological. It's how our brain works. So if we think about how we learn and how our brain processes learning, we make a set of synaptic connections. So we learn something, and a set of synaptic connections are forged in our brain, and that's fantastic because it means we don't have to relearn those things. So, if we could ask everybody in the chat to raise their hand about who brushed their teeth this morning. I think everybody will have brushed their teeth, and most of us do things like that without thinking. We don't have to relearn how to put the toothpaste on the toothbrush and how to put that in our mouth and how to make the circuit. Maybe some of us have some mnemonics and some ways of remembering how long we're going to brush and make sure we hit all 4 quadrants and so on.
And
but
washing.
we know how to do it. Hand washing
yes.
is a new one, right? So we have been learning hand washing. That's a nice relevant one. Okay, I'm going to wash on the top. I'm going to do, there are some ways to make sure you get your entire hand that we've been seeing. So we're learning these new things. We're able to do those without relearning. So the fact that our brain works that way is fantastic, except for when it comes to doing something new. And when it comes to doing something new, what we find is we slip into those neural pathways that have been formed in our brain, and we fall back to solving the problem the way that our brain has been wired to solve the problem. So the first problem is biological, and in order to think wrong, we actually have to trick our brain into considering some new possibilities, into trying something new that gets it out of that little synaptic connection rut that we have in there, that serves us extraordinarily well on a day-to-day basis, but doesn't when it comes to coming up with original or creative new thoughts. The other force that we're dealing with is culture. And if you think about culture as a collection of brains operating in that way. I'm going to change my background to emphasize that. So I said, I have a set of synaptic connections in my brain that goes from A to B. Collectively, we have a set of synaptic connections that go to our brains when it comes to cultural norms. So depending on the culture that you're coming from, you'll find, and you can think about this in a workplace culture as well as in a national or regional culture. Mike comes from Newcastle. So he was born and raised in a culture that believed in a football team that will never win.
Not true.
So he has a cultural bias towards this team, which isn't based on fact. It's not based on performance. It's just based on story and lore that gets passed on from generation to generation. And this is true in our allegiance to football clubs. Who do you, if you're in Newcastle, what football club do you hate?
Sunderland.
Okay, so there you go. So, and for no reason other than you've been raised to hate them. Like, I am a baseball fan, so I love the San Francisco Giants, which means I therefore hate the Dodgers. Now, there's no factual basis for my hatred towards the Dodgers other than the fact that I was brought up in a culture to do that. So if you think our cultural norms are really informed by a set of beliefs, by kind of a belief structure and a set of orthodoxies that are reinforced. And that we see that in workplaces that are trying to build cultures of innovation or cultures of inclusiveness, or right. We try to create a belief structure around that, and then we try to perform and act accordingly. Again, our culture gets in the way. When I look at some of these responses, right, that have to do with a willingness to try new things. Can we get leadership to believe in experimentation? Can we, that's what we're hearing in those, or what I'm reading into those is a cultural resistance, a sort of a pushback. So at the very heart of thinking wrong is this idea of how do we overcome both the biological programming, right, the way our brain works, and how do we overcome our cultural norms to allow us to explore those bold paths, to allow us to go out and explore those new possibilities. And we always like to say that when you're on that bold path, if you're suggesting something that people laugh nervously about or act uncomfortable about or say is weird or strange or bizarre, you should take that as encouragement. That means you're on the right path, because that means you are by definition doing something abnormal. The predictable path is the normal. When we go off onto that bold path, we're doing something that's abnormal. It is pushing against the way our brain works, and it's pushing against the way our culture works to explore that. So that's the sort of underlying thesis of thinking wrong, is how do we actually get our brains and our cultures to think wrong? All of that, I think people generally say, yeah, that makes sense. I believe that. I buy into that. Rita, what I'm really interested in is the fact that we've had this we've had this extraordinary event, right, where we've been forced into thinking wrong. We've been forced into this sort of area where the assumptions and orthodoxies and beliefs. Somebody said it as we were doing that exercise, right? Everything that we accepted to be was true is not true. Mm-hmm. We'll all be able to go out today and gather at a bar. We'll all be able to take an airplane to go to Chicago. We'll all be able to, go to that medical conference in New Orleans. It's like, no, you don't get to do any of those things. Right. We're going to have a supply chain that's not disrupted. We're going to have people who can work free of fear of dying in a meat packing plant, right? All of those things that we assumed, we presumed, we just took for granted. We said, no, that'll be true in the future.